The annual Flaxborough Illumination Gala had begun, as it always did, with a mixture of civic pride and low-grade disorganization. A wooden podium, borrowed from the Methodist Hall and already wobbling from its journey, stood beside the Millpond's edge, festooned with paper lanterns. Behind it, a temporary sign proclaimed in optimistic gold paint, "Light over water, a new era for Flaxborough." At precisely 8:30, Mayor Digby Chalmers ascended the dais, carrying both his speech and the expression of a man who suspected his chain of office had been polished with boot polish again. The small crowd, wrapped in their best coats and muffled in scarves, hummed with anticipation and mild resentment at the breeze that kept extinguishing their candles. Among them, Mrs. Tither, the vicar's wife, whispered that the bulbs looked a touch foreign. Her husband murmured assent, though privately wondered what nationality electric light might possess. The ceremony, like so many in Flaxborough, proceeded in two speeds, slow and suddenly calamitous when the mayor reached his climactic line. And so, my friends, as we illuminate our civic pond, may we likewise illuminate the... He pulled the brass lever beside him. The lamps flickered to life with an audible snap. A cheer rose, half genuine. The pond blazed into reflection, shimmering ribbons of gold across still, oily water. Then someone screamed. At first, people mistook it for excitement. It wasn't until the second scream, sharper, thinner, that the crowd turned, under the second lamp, where the string of bulbs dipped low over the water. A shape floated, pale, unmoving. Its face, if face it was, pressed against the faint ripple of the pond's surface. "Good heavens," breathed Mrs. Tither, gripping her husband's sleeve. "Is that one of the councillors?" The vicar, whose eyesight was better suited to hymn books, peered. "I believe," he said slowly, "that it may be Miss Harby." The mayor, caught halfway between ceremonial dignity and practical confusion, waved his arms vaguely at the constable. "Yes, yes, do something, Jenkins." Constable Jenkins, who had never yet fished anything more serious than a bicycle from the mill pond, stepped forward with visible reluctance. Within moments, his trousers were soaked to the knee. A minute later, with the help of two young men from the gasworks, he pulled the figure ashore. Miss Alma Harby, former treasurer of the Women's Guild, known for her quick tongue and immovable principles, lay before them, still and ghastly beneath the yellow lamps. Her hand, oddly, was clenched around a small, sodden piece of fabric, red silk as if torn from something finer than her usual wardrobe. "She can't have fallen in," murmured Mrs. Tither, voicing the thought everyone shared but none dared declare. "She's far too particular for puddles, let alone ponds." Mayor Chalmers cleared his throat with the authority of a man who had never encountered death outside a newspaper. "A tragic accident, clearly," he announced. "The edge is damp, very unsafe indeed." From somewhere at the back, a voice replied, "Not half as unsafe as her bookkeeping." Laughter, nervous and short-lived, rippled through the onlookers. Only Inspector Purbright, standing quietly by the far side of the crowd, did not move. He had arrived without ceremony. No one had noticed him leave the station, and now he observed the scene with mild, unreadable interest. His gaze rested not on the body, nor the mayor's sweating brow, but on the small wooden crate that supported the switchgear for the new lights. A faint hum still came from it, the sort of sound a man might ignore until it set his teeth on edge. He looked up at the string of bulbs. One was dark. The one directly above where Miss Harby had floated. "Curious," he murmured, almost to himself. Sergeant Malley, approaching with a notepad and the defensive air of a man allergic to public scrutiny, asked him, "Sir, shall we clear the area?" "In due course," Purbright replied. "For now, let them talk. It's what they do best." He turned back toward the pond, where the electric light shimmered like molten brass across the rippling water. The body, now covered with a borrowed cloak, looked pitifully small beside it, as though death had deflated the moral stiffness Miss Harby was once known for. Already, fragments of theory drifted among the crowd like midges over the water. Someone claimed she'd slipped while fixing her hat. Another insisted she'd been pushed. One gentleman hinted at romantic entanglements, which his wife promptly corrected with a snort. Purbright heard it all but wrote nothing down. The truth, he knew, would not be found in what people said tonight, but in what they did not say tomorrow. And somewhere between the switched-off lamp, the silk scrap in Miss Harby's hand, and the mayor's insistence on accident, a pattern, faint but distinct, had already begun to take shape in his mind. By the following morning, the Millpond had resumed its usual glassy indifference, as though nothing so untidy as death had ever disturbed its surface. The bunting from the previous night still drooped across the railings, colours dulled by dew. Two mallards, indifferent to civic tragedy, paddled where the body had been found. In the front parlours and back kitchens of Flaxborough, however, serenity was in short supply. Word of Miss Harby's death had spread with the velocity of rumour and the precision of embroidery. By breakfast she had been alternatively drowned, electrocuted, poisoned, or struck by lightning. By elevenses she had been murdered twice and buried once, then exhumed by an unqualified undertaker. At Mrs. Gloss's tea-rooms, which occupied a narrow wedge between the haberdasher and the solicitor's office, half the town's female population had gathered under the pretext of moral support. The air was thick with steam, sugar, and satisfaction. Mrs. Gloss, a woman whose understanding of tragedy extended only so far as burnt scones, circulated between tables like a benevolent storm cloud. "It's a terrible thing." "Of course," she said, refilling cups with tragic flourish. "Terrible. Mind you, Alma Harby never was what you'd call even-tempered. Always ready to criticize, she was. I said to her only last week, 'Alma,' I said, 'people won't like you if you keep telling them how to run the guild.' And she said, 'Well, I won't repeat it here.' I expect she fell," offered Mrs. Pratt, the station-master's wife, stirring her tea as though it might yield evidence. The edge of the pond's slippery. They said she was wearing those dreadful little heels again. "Vanity's a sin, you know." "I heard," said Miss Smeath, who never allowed ignorance to impede her contributions, "that the mayor's lever gave her a shock. Electric straight through the metal railing. Poor woman never stood a chance." "That," said Mrs. Gloss, lowering her voice for effect, "would make it the council's fault. And you know how they feel about responsibility." A ripple of knowing laughter followed. Responsibility in Flaxborough was a communal delicacy. Everyone admired it, no one digested it. Across town, in the snug of the Three Swans, similar speculations were decanted into ale. Men who had never spoken to Miss Harby in life now analysed her character with posthumous confidence. Mr. Rudge, the plumber, was certain it had been some kind of woman's business. Jealousy, you know. His friend, Mr. Pym, disagreed. No woman in her right mind would drown herself in that pond. Filthy thing. It's the council's water, not God's. While theories fermented, Inspector Purbright sat in the quiet of his office, listening to Sergeant Malley's summary of the morning's chatter. The sergeant, whose idea of precision was admirable if not always accurate, had compiled an impressive list of improbabilities. "Mrs. Tither says the deceased was arguing with someone just before the ceremony, sir." "Can't recall who, but she insists it was a man." "Then again, Mrs. Tither tends to classify anyone taller than herself as a man." Purbright leaned back, hands clasped, gaze resting on the clock's slow pendulum. "And the electrician?" "Mr. Lant, sir, says his wiring's perfectly safe. Swears the lamps couldn't have caused any shock unless someone tampered with them. He was rather quick to mention that, actually." Purbright smiled faintly. "Men who are innocent rarely rehearse their innocence so early in the day," Malley frowned. "So you think I think," said Purbright mildly, "that people seldom kill for technical reasons." "It's generally emotional. or administrative. Outside, a light rain began to fall, more drizzle than weather. Through the misted window, Purbright could see the market square gradually filling with umbrellas. The sight reminded him of something, the sodden scrap of red silk in Miss Harby's hand. No one had yet identified it. A fragment of scarf, perhaps? Or a token of temper? By midday, Purbright left the station and took his usual unhurried path through the high street. He nodded to passers-by, received condolences on behalf of the constabulary, and paused briefly outside the post office where the queue, unusually long, murmured in low tones, "Miss Teal." The postmistress looked up as he entered. "Morning, Inspector." Dreadful business, that poor woman. We were only saying she'd have hated dying on gala night. She never approved of frivolity. Indeed, said Purbright. Was she posting anything lately? Miss Teal tilted her head, considering the moral implications of sharing postal trivia. Not in the last week. But she did collect a registered letter last Thursday. London stamp, very official looking, addressed to her at home. Oh yes, she was most particular about the receipt. Folded it into her purse, I noticed. She said something about settling matters once and for all. Sounded cross, but then she always did. Purbright thanked her and stepped out into the drizzle. The phrase echoed in his mind, settling matters once and for all. In Flaxborough, such resolutions were rarely peaceful. By late afternoon, the town's collective sympathy had ripened into moral certainty. Everyone knew who must be to blame. They simply disagreed on who that was. The Women's Guild met informally at the vicarage, each member determined to exhibit sorrow in proportion to her dislike of the deceased. Councillor Hargreaves declared that safety regulations would be reviewed immediately, which everyone took to mean filed and forgotten. At twilight, as the lamps flickered again across the Millpond, Purbright returned to the scene. The water, faintly stirred by wind, reflected the bulbs in trembling lines. A workman from the council, grumbling about overtime, coiled the electric cable near the dais. Purbright watched him for a moment. "Tell me," he said conversationally, "was Miss Harby standing near this switch when the mayor turned it on?" "Could have been," the man replied. "She was always poking around, telling us what we'd done wrong. Might have grabbed the railing, though. She had no business there, if you ask me." Purbright nodded, his eyes following the line of the lamps once more. The dark bulb remained unreplaced, a small, imperfect gap in the otherwise cheerful display. He looked down at the edge of the pond. A footprint, blurred but still visible, led away from the water toward the back path, larger than Miss Harby's shoe, pressed deep into the damp soil. The inspector stood for a while, silent, as if listening to the pond's quiet breathing. Then, with a sigh that might have been amusement or melancholy, he turned and walked back into the dimly lit town. Flaxborough, for all its noise, never really noticed when someone was watching it think. Morning returned to Flaxborough with the faintly apologetic light of a town trying to look respectable again. The flags over the town hall, hastily lowered in tribute, flapped limply in a wind that smelled faintly of varnish and damp bunting. Inspector Purbright arrived precisely at 9, his hat still shining from the drizzle that refused to give up the previous night's habit. The mayor was waiting for him in his office, a square room upholstered entirely in self-importance. Mayor Chalmers, whose complexion resembled a poached ham and whose moustache aspired to military dignity, gestured toward the visitor's chair with the air of a man bestowing a minor honor. "My dear Inspector," he began, "a most unfortunate occurrence, but we mustn't allow hysteria to take root. The public needs assurance, calm, order, leadership." "Not sensationalism," Purbright seated himself quietly. "Of course, Your Worship. Though in cases where the deceased is found holding a torn scrap of silk, calm can be a relative term." The mayor gave a nervous laugh. "Ah, yes, that. Dreadful. Pure coincidence, surely?" The woman was always clutching at something, but her handbag, her grievances, her reputation. "Still," said Purbright mildly, "coincidences make poor witnesses. Did Miss Harby have any quarrels with the council?" The mayor stiffened. "Good heavens, no. She merely expressed her views. Forcefully, yes, but she was entitled.
I may have had a word with her about the guild accounts last week, but nothing of significance. Purbright watched him over folded hands.
The mayor's eyes flickered toward the window, then to the paperweight on his desk, as though both might offer corroboration. "I understand she received an official letter from London," Purbright said. "Something that upset her." The mayor's pause lasted exactly long enough to be interesting.
Possibly.
"Though if she had, she didn't mention it to me. You know how women can be secretive about official matters." "Indeed," said Purbright, standing. "It's often the unofficial ones that cause more trouble." From the mayor's office he walked through the market square, where the traders had resumed their ordinary rituals of commerce and complaint. The death, though still conversational gold, had begun its descent into anecdote. People were already adding the customary embroidery, some even suggesting that Miss Harby had been mixed up in something theatrical. Purbright's next visit was to the modest home of Mrs. Harby, the deceased's widowed sister-in-law. The small house in St. Olave's Lane smelled of lavender polish and long disappointments. Mrs. Harby, a woman of angular kindness and deliberate mourning attire, greeted him with an expression designed for both sympathy and moral superiority. I can't say I was surprised. "Inspector," she began, leading him into a room arranged with funereal tidiness. "My sister-in-law always believed herself indispensable." "It's a dangerous illusion." Purbright accepted a cup of tea which tasted faintly of resignation. "Did she seem troubled recently?"
"Troubled? Always."
She was one of those people who need to be crossed to feel alive. Lately, she'd been agitated about something she called a great injustice, though she refused to explain. Said she would show them all. I assumed she meant the guild women or the council. Possibly both. Did she mention receiving any correspondence? Mrs. Harby's spoon paused mid-air. "A letter, yes, registered from London. She wouldn't say what it was, only that it would change everything." She went out later that day in high temper. When she returned, she said she'd been to see the mayor and that he'd pretended ignorance, whatever that meant. I told her to calm herself, but Alma was never one for calm. Always righteousness and indignation like salt and pepper. Purbright nodded slowly, glancing at the photographs on the mantelpiece, all arranged with mathematical spacing. One showed a younger Miss Harby, unsmiling beside a man in council robes. "Your late husband?" he asked. "Yes," said Mrs. Harby stiffly. "Clerk to the council for 30 years.
Honest as daylight. Alma never forgave them for the way they treated him after his illness.
She said she'd expose their fiddles one day. But people say things, don't they, Inspector?
Especially people who've been left behind." Purbright thanked her, left a polite card, and stepped into the grey daylight again.
The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and conspiracy. His next stop was the Electric Light Company on Mill Lane, where he found Mr. Arthur Lant, the electrician, perched on a stool among tangled cables and the scent of paraffin. Lant was a narrow man, all elbows and nerves, with a manner that suggested guilt even in perfect innocence. "Terrible business, sir," he said before Purbright spoke a word. "Whole town talking. Nothing to do with my wiring, I swear it. Perfectly insulated, every inch." "I'm sure it is," said Purbright, removing his gloves. "Though you did mention to Sergeant Malley that someone might have tampered with the circuit." Lant's eyes darted. "Only as a possibility, mind you. We left the switch unattended for 5 minutes while setting up."
Anyone could have meddled with it. People don't realize how dangerous these things are. Was Miss Harby one of those people? Lant hesitated.
"She was around, yes. Kept asking questions, whether the lights were safe, if they were properly inspected."
"I told her they'd passed regulation."
"She said she'd see for herself. Next thing I know, she's in the water."
"Awful thing." Purbright studied him for a moment. "You didn't like her?" "No one liked her," Lant blurted, then coloured.
"But I'd no reason to harm her."
"I've enough trouble without that."
"Got debts, yes, but you can't electrocute a woman to pay the grocer, can you?" The inspector's lips twitched. An admirably practical outlook. He turned to leave, then paused by the door. One last thing, did you notice any missing equipment after the gala? Only an umbrella, I think. Someone left one leaning against the dais when we packed up. Then it was gone.
Red handle, initials on it, MC, I believe.
Thought it might belong to the mayor. Purbright nodded.
Possibly.
Though mayors don't often carry umbrellas with silk tassels. He left Lance's workshop as the church clock struck noon. The sound echoed faintly across the town, mixing with the steady rumble of market chatter and the distant hiss of the Millpond's fountains. By the time he reached the square again, Purbright had formed no conclusions, only the comfortable awareness that conclusions were premature. He paused outside the town hall once more, looking up at its neat stone facade. Behind one of those curtained windows, he suspected,
lay a truth less tidy than its surroundings. He straightened his hat,
turned up his collar, and began the slow walk back to the station, the faintest hint of amusement tugging at his mouth. The kind that comes when a puzzle begins, ever so slightly to hum. The following day dawned thin and colourless, as though the town itself had been drained overnight by the effort of so much moral speculation. A pale mist drifted from the Millpond, curling between the market stalls like uninvited smoke. Inspector Purbright, standing by the railings, watched a council worker replace the darkened bulb that had troubled him since the gala. The man whistled tunelessly as he worked, unaware of the inspector's gaze. When the bulb flickered to life, Purbright turned away. His eyes followed the damp footprints leading toward Mill Lane, the same route he'd taken yesterday to see Arthur Lant. There was something about Lant, something not quite dishonest, but distinctly uncomfortable. A man with the air of someone perpetually apologizing to fate. He found the electrician again in his workshop, seated at a bench surrounded by spools of wire and unpaid bills. Lant looked up sharply, attempting a smile that arrived late and departed early. "Inspector, didn't expect you again so soon." "I find repetition useful," said Purbright, removing his gloves. "It gives people time to remember what they forgot to say the first time." Lant's hands paused over a tangle of copper wire.
"I told you everything. There's nothing more, of course."
"You mentioned debts yesterday rather candidly, I thought." "They must weigh heavily," Lant laughed nervously. "Well, I'm not ruined, if that's what you mean. Just a bit behind with the rent. Times are tight, indeed. And yet you managed to install a full lighting system for the gala. A profitable commission, surely?" Lant's fingers fidgeted with a screwdriver. "Hardly. The council's idea of payment is a promise and a receipt. Still, good publicity."
Or it would have been. Purbright wandered around the workshop, pausing by a half-finished lamp.
"You knew Miss Harby well?" "Only by reputation. Everyone knew her. She had opinions like other people have birthdays, regular and unavoidable. She questioned your wiring. She questioned everything."
"I told her to keep back from the switch, but she said she was checking for safety compliance." Lant swallowed, then added, "Next thing, she's in the water. I still can't believe it. Nor can most of Flaxborough," said Purbright gently.
"Tell me, were you near the lever when the lights came on?" "I was by the van fetching tools."
"Ask anyone. I intend to," said Purbright. "Did you notice anyone else by the pond? Perhaps someone who shouldn't have been?"
Lant hesitated. The mayor was fussing about, of course. And there was that woman from the guild, Mrs. Tither. She was pointing at the bulbs, saying they looked continental. Purbright's eyes twinkled.
"Did she now?" "A dangerous remark in certain company." Lant gave another of those uneasy smiles. "She's harmless."
"They all are, really."
"Harmless and curious."
"Except Miss Harby, of course. She could make you feel guilty for breathing too loudly." Purbright nodded, glancing at the desk. A small red mark stained the corner of a ledger. Perhaps oil, perhaps something else. He tapped it lightly.
"You've been busy." "Always am," Lant replied quickly.
"Got another job tonight. Fixing wiring in the mayor's office. He said something about wanting the fittings checked."
"Can't be too careful now," he said. "Thoughtful of him," murmured Purbright.
"And did he request you personally?" "Yes, through his clerk. Said he didn't trust anyone else after the gala. Purbright tucked his gloves under one arm and regarded Lant with mild curiosity. You must be flattered. Though I do wonder why a man so anxious about electricity would summon the one person everyone's talking about in connection with it. Lant's smile flickered.
You think he suspects me?
I think, said Purbright, that men like the mayor prefer to keep potential dangers within reach.
It saves the effort of pretending they don't exist. He left the workshop soon after, letting the door swing shut behind him.
Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain and paraffin. Across the street, a curtain twitched. One of the neighbours, perhaps drawn by the sight of the inspector's hat. Flaxborough, he thought, was a town where observation was the only sport that required no equipment. At noon, he returned to the station. Sergeant Malley was hunched over the desk, reading from a pile of witness statements. "Nothing useful, sir," he said glumly. "Half the town claims to have seen Miss Harby arguing with someone, but none can agree who. The mayor blames the lighting, Mrs. Tither blames the weather, and the guild blames modernity." Purbright sat down, loosening his scarf.
And the letter?
"Still looking, sir. We've searched her house and found nothing. The sister-in-law insists Miss Harby kept her papers in order."
But there's no trace of the envelope. That, said Purbright quietly,
"Is very much a trace in itself." He rose again after a few minutes, pacing to the window. Outside, the marketplace shimmered faintly in the weak sunlight. A delivery cart rumbled by, its wheels leaving shallow ruts in the cobbles. Life, as always, continued, politely ignoring its own undercurrents. That evening, Purbright visited the town hall. He found Mayor Chalmers in his office, sleeves rolled up, supervising Mr. Lant, who was on his knees beneath the desk, surrounded by wire. "Ah, Inspector," said the mayor with a forced brightness. "You've come to see diligence in action." "Can't be too careful after recent events," Purbright inclined his head. "Quite right. Prevention is always preferable to post-mortem reflection." He watched as Lant adjusted a fuse box, the nervous sweat visible on his neck.
No danger, I hope?
Purbright asked mildly. Lant glanced up. "None at all. Just routine," the mayor chuckled too loudly.
You see?
"Competent fellow, our Mr. Lant. A pity people talk so much nonsense." Purbright's gaze lingered on the mayor's desk, neat, but too neat. A faint outline on the wood suggested something had recently been removed. He noted it, said nothing. When Lant finished, he stood, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression, relieved yet uneasy, betrayed that peculiar guilt of the blameless, fear of being suspected. He met Purbright's eyes for a moment, tried another smile, then looked away. "Will that be all, sir?" he asked the mayor. "Yes, yes. Thank you, Lant. You've done splendidly." Purbright followed the electrician out into the hallway. "A small word, if I may," he said quietly. Lant stopped, shoulders stiffening. "If you find yourself working late tonight," Purbright continued, "take care near the fuse box. Flaxborough has a way of giving second chances, usually to those who survive the first." The electrician swallowed. "You don't think I think," said Purbright. "You should be careful who offers you tea." Then he walked away, leaving Lant standing beneath the flickering hall light, his nervous smile finally gone. By the following morning, the town had decided that Inspector Purbright was surely on the brink of revelation. No such revelation existed, of course, but Flaxborough had never allowed evidence to obstruct enthusiasm. At the Three Swans, they were already debating whether Miss Harby's death would be considered the first real murder since the vicar's unfortunate accident with the lawn roller of 1939. Purbright, however, spent his morning not among gossipers, but in the quiet corridors of the town hall. His attention had returned to the remark Mr. Lant made about a missing umbrella. Red handle, silk tassels, initials MC. Such an object did not strike him as merely lost. Things in Flaxborough rarely disappeared without taking a scrap of truth along with them. He found the mayor's secretary, Miss Dobson, arranging papers in the reception office with the solemnity of a cathedral librarian. She was a thin woman whose spectacles seemed perpetually shocked, by what they witnessed. "Good morning, Miss Dobson," Purbright greeted her gently.
I wonder, does the mayor own an umbrella with a red handle?
She looked appalled. "The mayor? Good heavens, no."
His is black, very black.
"He says colour suggests instability." "Quite so."
And Councillor Hargreaves?
"Green plaid. It drips dreadfully. His wife despises it." Purbright smiled faintly. "Then perhaps the initials MC might belong to another civic soul. Someone with a flair for silk tassels." Miss Dobson pursed her lips. "The only person with initials MC here is Mrs. Mabel Chalmers, the mayor's wife." "Yes. She's on the committee for the illumination gala, always carries an umbrella, rain or shine."
Says it completes the outfit. Does she indeed?
Purbright murmured, glancing toward the door of the mayor's office. It was shut, but through the glass he could see the faint shadow of movement, broad shoulders, brisk gestures, the faintest flicker of agitation. He left without knocking. There would be time enough for that later. By midday he was standing once more beside the Millpond, the scene now oddly serene under a pale wash of sunlight. The bunting had been taken down. Only the iron railing, faintly rusted where Miss Harby had leaned, offered any reminder of tragedy. Purbright examined the damp soil at the pond's edge. The deeper footprint from before was now smudged, almost gone, but a faint, curved impression remained. Something narrow, pointed, the tip of a walking stick, or perhaps an umbrella ferrule. A light cough behind him made him turn. It was Mrs. Tither, the vicar's wife, dressed in black with an expression that managed to combine pity, pride, and curiosity in equal measure. "Inspector," she said, clasping her hands, "we were praying for poor Miss Harby this morning. Such a sad business. I dare say the Lord will sort out who's to blame in his own time." "I dare say he will," said Purbright, "though he may appreciate a little local assistance." Mrs. Tither blushed. "Of course. You'll want to know what I saw that night."
I've been meaning to tell you. I noticed someone walking away from the pond just before the scream.
"A woman, I think. Tall, wearing a light coat. She had something red in her hand. An umbrella, perhaps." Mrs. Tither frowned. "It might have been. I couldn't be sure. The lights were dazzling, but she moved quickly, almost as though she didn't wish to be recognized." "Did you see where she went?" "Up toward the town hall, I believe." "But, Inspector," she hesitated, glancing about to ensure they were unobserved. "I shouldn't like to think ill of anyone, but she had the kind of walk Mrs. Chalmers has. Upright, you know, decisive. But then again, half the women in Flaxborough think walking briskly gives the impression of purpose." Purbright thanked her with genuine warmth. Gossip, in his view, was often more reliable than confession. At least gossip didn't pretend to be pure. That afternoon, back at the station, Sergeant Malley returned from errands with a small triumph. "Found this in the lost property cupboard, sir. It was turned in this morning by the janitor from the town hall." He laid the object carefully on the desk. It was an umbrella, red-handled, with fraying silk tassels and the initials MC embossed in gold at the base. The fabric was damp, though the day had been dry since dawn. Purbright examined it closely. Where was it found? In the council's storage closet, behind some old posters from last year's election. Janitor says it must have been there a few days. Purbright turned the handle thoughtfully, tracing the initials with his thumb. "Curious thing to forget," he murmured, "particularly for a lady of taste." Malley, who was unaccustomed to subtleties, said, "You think she dropped it that night?" "I think," Purbright replied, "that someone wished to make it appear she hadn't been near the pond at all." He dismissed the sergeant and sat for a long time alone, the umbrella propped against his desk. Outside, the evening light faded into a slow, soft gloom, and the lamps along the high street began to flicker awake. There was comfort in their regularity. Unlike human nature, their brightness could be switched on and off at will. Around 8, Purbright left the station and walked to the Chalmers residence on Church Road. It was a tidy house, the sort that gave the impression of being ironed each morning. Mrs. Mabel Chalmers answered the door herself, wearing an expression polished for social visits and condolence teas. "Inspector, how unexpected. Do come in. My husband's at the club, I'm afraid." "No matter," said Purbright, stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender and starch. "I won't keep you long. I believe I have something of yours." He handed her the umbrella. She took it, eyes widening just enough for honesty to falter. "Why, yes. I must have mislaid it at the gala." "So careless of me." "Careless?" Purbright repeated softly. "A fine umbrella like that with initials so distinctive. I'd have thought one would notice its absence sooner." Her lips tightened. "It's been a difficult few days, Inspector. One forgets small things." Purbright inclined his head. "Quite so. Only this particular small thing was found in the town hall's storage closet, behind election posters, no less." For a heartbeat, she said nothing. Then she smiled, a trained, civic smile that served as both answer and defense. "How odd," she said lightly. "I suppose the janitor must have picked it up and stored it there. He's dreadfully conscientious." "I'm sure he is." Purbright's gaze rested gently but unyieldingly on her face. "Tell me, Mrs. Chalmers, did you speak with Miss Harby that evening?" She hesitated, then sighed. "Briefly. She was complaining about the accounts again. Honestly, that woman could find corruption in a hymn book. I told her she was making herself ill. That was all." Purbright nodded as though satisfied, though the smallest crease appeared at the corner of his mouth, a private acknowledgment of a lie politely delivered. He took his leave soon after, tipping his hat. As the door closed behind him, the faint scent of lavender lingered on his coat. Walking back through the quiet streets, he glanced up at the sky reflected in the Millpond. The lights trembled across its surface, broken into pieces by the water's restless breathing. Somewhere beneath them, truth floated just as silently, waiting to be drawn ashore. The next morning arrived with a deceptive brightness that made the cobbles shine as though Flaxborough itself had been scrubbed overnight. The illusion didn't last long. By 10 o'clock, the town had resumed its ordinary murmur of duty and speculation, and nowhere did that murmur run thicker than within the sanctified walls of the Women's Guild. Purbright approached their meeting hall with a mild sense of foreboding. The Women's Guild was not, strictly speaking, a social organization. It was more a parliament of grievance. Its members wielded teacups like gavels and minutes like manifestos. Yet it was precisely in such places that Flaxborough's truth tended to leak, drop by drop, between the cracks of civility. Inside, the atmosphere was equal parts starch and sugar. A banner reading Service and Sisterhood drooped above a long table strewn with needlework and unspoken rivalry. Mrs. Tither presided, flanked by Mrs. Gloss, Miss Smeath, and 2 other ladies of formidable moral stature. They greeted Purbright with a collective intake of breath, the sound of scandal preparing to take notes. "Inspector Purbright," Mrs. Tither exclaimed, "we were just discussing how dreadful it is that Flaxborough should be in the papers again. So unfortunate for the town's image." "I can imagine," said Purbright mildly. "Though the deceased was one of your own members, was she not?" "Indeed," said Mrs. Gloss, pouring tea with tragic solemnity. "Treasurer of our branch, fastidious, reliable, impossible to please. Her accounts were always immaculate, unless, of course, one looked too closely." Miss Smeath gasped. "You don't mean she was dishonest?" Mrs. Gloss dabbed her mouth delicately. "Not dishonest, dear, just imaginative. Numbers were her poetry." Purbright stirred his tea. Did anyone besides Miss Harby handle the guild accounts? Mrs. Tither leaned forward conspiratorially. Only Mrs. Chalmers occasionally. She took over during Miss Harby's illness last year. They never quite agreed on methods. Alma insisted on double-entry bookkeeping. Mrs. Chalmers preferred to trust Providence. Was there animosity between them? Not at all, Mrs. Tither said, with the expression of someone describing a gunpowder factory as peaceful. Just a difference in temperament. Alma was exacting. Mrs. Chalmers believes faith can reconcile any discrepancy, even financial ones. Purbright nodded. Faith, in my experience, can reconcile many things, even evidence. The remark earned him a ripple of uncertain laughter. He sipped his tea slowly, allowing silence to settle. Silence, he found, was an excellent interrogator. It often persuaded people to fill it. Mrs. Gloss, unable to resist the pull, leaned closer. Of course, Inspector, there were rumours about the gala funds. Miss Harby was threatening to bring the matter up at next month's meeting, said she had proof of irregularities. Naturally, we didn't listen. We are Christian women, not auditors. Purbright set his cup down gently. And what sort of irregularities? Donations, she whispered. Several entered in the ledger but never deposited in the guild's account. Alma said she knew who was responsible, but she wouldn't name names. Said she'd do it publicly. Was Mrs. Chalmers present when she said this? Oh, yes, said Miss Smeath. She went rather pale, as I recall, though she always does under gaslight. Purbright thanked them politely, declining a third cup of tea on medical grounds. As he left, he heard the rustle of resumed speculation behind him, a gentle chorus of civic self-importance, reasserting its rhythm. Outside, the sunlight had turned watery again. Purbright crossed the square, pausing to study the town hall's facade. The building's stone dignity seemed to him slightly performative, the architectural equivalent of a straight face told in a lie. He stopped by the post office next. Miss Teal, behind her counter, greeted him with her usual blend of discretion and delight. More developments, Inspector? Possibly, he said. You mentioned the registered letter to Miss Harby. You wouldn't happen to recall the sender? Miss Teal's eyes flickered. I shouldn't, officially. But since you ask, it came from the Ministry of Local Affairs. She signed for it herself. I remember because she used her full name, Alma Florence Harby. People only use their full names when they're angry or in love. Purbright smiled faintly. And in Miss Harby's case? She was angry, positively radiating purpose. She said it concerned misappropriations. I assumed she meant the mayor's office. Or the guild, Purbright murmured. Miss Teal shrugged. In Flaxborough, Inspector, they're often the same thing. He thanked her and stepped outside into the crisp air. Across the street, Mrs. Chalmers emerged from a milliner's shop, her posture immaculate, her smile serene. She carried a small parcel and walked as if the pavement existed solely for her convenience. The red-handled umbrella was conspicuously absent. Purbright watched her until she turned the corner toward the town hall, where her husband's office window overlooked the square. A light flickered briefly behind the curtain. Perhaps a signal, perhaps nothing. Yet something in the smooth choreography of her movements unsettled him. It was not guilt exactly, but a kind of premeditated grace, the poise of a woman who knew where every step would land. Back at the station, Sergeant Malley was attempting to coax coherence from the town's growing pile of statements. "There's a new rumour, sir," he said. "They say Miss Harby found proof that funds meant for the new lighting scheme were redirected. People think the mayor's mixed up in it." "People think many things," Purbright said, hanging his coat. Sometimes they even think correctly. Mally frowned. Do you believe it's connected to her death? I believe everything in Flaxborough is connected, Purbright replied. The trick is finding the knot rather than the thread. He opened the file containing Miss Harby's last known correspondence. Among the receipts and tidy entries, one page stood out, a draft letter unsent, addressed to the Secretary, Ministry of Local Affairs. In it, she accused an unnamed party of falsifying donation records and hinted at the mayor's complicity. The letter ended abruptly, the last line unfinished. If anything should happen to me? Purbright closed the folder slowly, his eyes lingering on the half-written sentence. He had no doubt Miss Harby intended to finish it, but someone else had finished it for her. Outside, evening settled over Flaxborough once more, dimming its chimneys and lanterns until the town appeared almost peaceful. The inspector leaned back in his chair, listening to the faint hum of the telephone wires. Somewhere between those murmuring lines, gossip was already evolving into narrative, and narrative, in Flaxborough, had a dangerous way of becoming belief. Purbright reached for his pipe, but didn't light it. Instead, he looked through the window toward the faint glow of the town hall and murmured to himself, "The Guild keeps minutes of every meeting.
I wonder who's editing them now." The night after Purbright read Miss Harby's unfinished letter was one of uneasy stillness.
The town slept, or pretended to, beneath a pale, watery moon. The streets of Flaxborough, normally untroubled after dark, seemed to hold their breath, as though even the lamplight feared to stir what the daylight gossip had already unsettled. Shortly before midnight, a constable on patrol, young and zealous in ways experience would later correct, noticed a thin thread of smoke rising from behind the Millpond boathouse. At first, he mistook it for mist, until a faint crackle reached his ears. Within minutes, he was hammering on the door of the police station, face red and words tumbling over one another. Purbright, roused from his office chair where he had been reviewing the Guild minutes, arrived at the scene 10 minutes later. The fire was modest, more sulky than fierce, and the boathouse itself still stood, its boards blackened but intact. The smell, however, was sharp and acrid, not of timber but of something chemical, something deliberate. "Any witnesses?" Purbright asked quietly. The constable shook his head. "No, sir. Just saw the glow. Could have been going for an hour or more before anyone noticed." Purbright knelt beside the smouldering remains of what appeared to be a small crate. Inside, half consumed by flame, were the remnants of several papers, charred edges, fragments of type. He picked one up carefully with his penknife. Only a few words survived. Donation record, a lighting fund. He turned it over. The reverse bore faint initials in a neat, familiar hand, AFH. The inspector stared at the glowing embers for a long moment, the warmth barely reaching him. Miss Alma Florence Harby had been thorough in life, but apparently someone else was proving equally thorough in erasing her. By dawn, the fire was out, the remains collected in a tin box, and the constable sent home for tea and discretion. Purbright stood on the embankment as light began to seep through the mist. The pond, calm again, reflected a dull sky and the ghost of smoke drifting lazily upward. He turned as Sergeant Mally arrived, yawning into his hand. "Boathouse fire, sir."
"Another accident?"
Purbright's eyes didn't move from the water. "Accidents are popular in Flaxborough this month. Perhaps we should open an office for them," Mally frowned. "Could it be the same person, sir? Whoever killed Miss Harby? It would be an ambitious coincidence if it weren't." Purbright handed him the tin box. "Take these fragments to the lab in Norby, see what can be salvaged." And quietly, Mally, "The fewer people who know, the more we'll learn." The sergeant nodded, still half asleep, but aware enough not to ask questions. When he left, Purbright lingered a while longer by the water. The faint smell of burnt paper clung to the damp air, mingling with the pond's habitual scent of algae and civic neglect. As he turned to leave, a shape caught his eye near the edge of the boathouse, a piece of cloth snagged on a splintered board. He crouched and freed it. The fabric was red silk, slightly scorched, with a delicate tassel at one corner. The same material Miss Harby had clutched in her dead hand. He folded it neatly and slipped it into his pocket. Later that morning, as the town reawakened to its habitual routines, the fire was already the day's newest entertainment. The Three Swans offered the latest version. The inspector found a suicide note in the ashes. By the time it reached the post office queue, it had become secret government documents. Purbright, hearing both variations within an hour, was privately reassured. Wild invention usually meant someone was afraid of the truth. Around noon, he called upon Mayor Chalmers. The mayor, unshaven and harried, looked less like the figure of civic authority and more like a man dodging his own conscience. His eyes darted briefly to the inspector's pocket, as though suspecting it held a verdict. A dreadful business, Inspector. Terrible. The boathouse of all places, why, symbolic, you know. The town's recreation tarnished. Symbolism is rarely accidental, Purbright replied mildly. The fire appears to have consumed certain financial records, pertaining perhaps to the Illumination Fund. The mayor blanched.
Surely not.
The documents were kept at the council office. Some of them, said Purbright. But I believe Miss Harby may have removed copies for safekeeping. You recall, she was not easily persuaded to trust her superiors. The mayor's fingers toyed with a paper knife. If she did, that was entirely irregular. Quite, said Purbright. It seems irregularity is catching. He watched the man's colour shift from indignation to unease. Did Mrs. Chalmers mention seeing Miss Harby again that evening? The question landed gently like a dropped feather, but it stirred a wind all the same. The mayor's hand froze.
My wife, no. She went home early.
The whole affair upset her terribly, Purbright smiled faintly. Understandable. She's been very helpful, by the way. Such a pity about her umbrella. The mayor's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Umbrella? Yes, the one found in the town hall storage cupboard.
Odd how civic items migrate, don't you think?
Chalmers swallowed hard.
Well, yes.
Yes, indeed, Purbright inclined his head, courteous as ever. You'll let me know if anything else migrates unexpectedly, won't you? He left the mayor sitting behind his desk, looking like a man who had discovered that silence was heavier than speech. By late afternoon, the inspector had returned to the Millpond. The embers behind the boathouse were cold now, but the ground still smelled faintly of smoke and gilt. The constable on duty reported nothing unusual except that someone had been seen walking there early that morning. A woman, again, tall and brisk. Purbright didn't ask who. In Flaxborough, there was usually only one woman who walked as though she owned the scenery. He stood for a while, watching the pond's ripples glide outward from a single drifting leaf. Then he turned, glancing toward the distant town hall, its windows gleaming faintly in the dull light. Somewhere inside that building, he knew, the remaining pieces of this puzzle were being quietly rearranged, and yet, he smiled slightly, even the most careful hands leave fingerprints. Evening had fallen by the time. Inspector Purbright returned to the station, bringing with him the faint scent of smoke and damp air. The constables had long gone home, leaving the building to its usual night noises, the creak of floorboards, the sigh of settling walls, the ticking clock that kept order more faithfully than any sergeant. He hung his coat on the stand, lit the small brass lamp on his desk, and sat for a long moment without moving. Outside the window, Flaxborough lay draped in its modest darkness. A few lamps still glowed in the high street, and somewhere in the distance a milk cart clattered homeward over the cobbles. The Millpond was invisible now, though he could imagine its surface, still black, and faintly luminous under the reflection of those same streetlights that had once illuminated death. On his desk lay the charred tin box from the boathouse, the recovered red silk, and a sheaf of typed reports that offered information. but no meaning. Purbright opened the first of them, skimmed the lines and closed it again. Paperwork, he thought, was the polite disguise of confusion. People buried uncertainty under forms, just as the guilty buried evidence under fires. He rose, walked to the window and looked out. From this height, he could see part of the town hall's upper windows, one still lit, its curtain half drawn. A silhouette moved inside, unmistakably feminine. Mrs. Chalmers perhaps paying an after-hours visit to her husband's office, or perhaps ensuring something stayed unseen. Purbright's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened slightly, the way a cat's might before the faintest movement of prey. He had learned long ago that evil in Flaxborough did not wear masks or carry daggers. It came powdered, perfumed, and immaculately polite. He turned back to his desk and picked up Miss Harby's unfinished letter again. The ink had faded slightly where the paper had been damp, but the meaning had not.
If anything should happen to me.
The words ended abruptly, but they carried the peculiar confidence of someone who had already made herself an inconvenience. Miss Harby, he thought, had not merely been killed. She had been interrupted. The door creaked and Sergeant Malley entered, hat in hand, his expression one of weary curiosity. "Evening, sir. Thought you'd gone home." "I was thinking," said Purbright. "That never bodes well," Malley murmured. "The lab reports come back on the papers from the fire. Most of it's ash, but they managed to read part of a line. Something about transferred without council approval." Purbright nodded slowly. "So she was right then. The funds were misused. Looks that way. Question is by who? The mayor's got his hands full of committees, but nothing sticks to him. Mrs. Chalmers, though, she had access through the guild. Maybe she—" Purbright raised a hand, silencing him gently.
"Let's not accuse anyone yet, Malley."
"Not until they accuse themselves. People here tend to do that eventually, usually over tea." Malley gave a faint smile.
"You think she'll crack?"
"She won't need to. The town will do it for her." When Malley had gone, Purbright stood once more at the window. The light in the town hall was still burning, steady and deliberate. He could almost imagine the scene inside. Mabel Chalmers, immaculate as ever, unlocking a drawer, gloved fingers extracting a document, replacing it with something cleaner. A ledger rewritten, a record erased, all done with the same composure with which he poured tea at guild meetings. He watched until the light finally went out and the window became a dark square against the pale stone. Then he returned to his desk and made a small note on the corner of his blotter. "Observe Mrs. Chalmers. Not when she speaks, but when she listens." He sat again, lighting his pipe. The smoke curled upward in thin, meditative spirals, like thought taking visible form. He considered the peculiar economy of small towns, how gossip and guilt circulated together, how everyone owed something to someone, whether in debt or silence. In Flaxborough, he reflected, morality was like its air, slightly damp, faintly perfumed and never entirely clean. People sinned politely here, with minutes recorded, chairs properly stacked afterward, and forgiveness expressed through committees. Murder, in such a setting, was not a disruption of order. It was an extension of it. His eyes drifted to the silk tassel lying on the desk, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. It was delicate, easily frayed. He ran a thumb over it, thinking of Mrs. Chalmers's hand, elegant, steady, the kind that never trembled unless by design. How easily that same hand might have reached for Miss Harby's arm beside the pond, one quick push disguised by the shuffle of the crowd. And yet, he reminded himself, certainty was dangerous company.
He would wait.
There were other ways to reveal the truth, quieter ones. Outside, the town clock struck 11, its chimes spreading through the empty streets like a reminder of time's disapproval. Purbright leaned back in his chair, watching the reflection of the lamp tremble faintly against the window pane. A small shadow moved across it. A bird, perhaps, or a person passing below. He didn't turn to look. In Flaxborough, people were always watching someone. It was a pastime older than fishing and considerably more profitable. He smiled to himself, a slow, private smile. The puzzle was tightening, each thread pulling against another. There was guilt here, woven neatly between civic virtue and social obligation, and soon it would have to show its seam. Purbright extinguished the lamp, leaving only the faint silver light of the moon. The town hall stood dark now, its windows blank, its secrets tucked away for the night. But he knew better. Paper burned, lies rewrote themselves, and silence had a voice all its own. As he drew the curtains, he thought again of Miss Harby. Fastidious, indignant, inconvenient. She had died not because she was wrong, but because she was right in a town that preferred wrongness tidy. He looked out once more, before closing the curtain completely. Across the square, a faint figure was walking away from the town hall, coat drawn tight, steps measured and certain. A woman's shape, unmistakably. Purbright watched her until she disappeared into the mist, then whispered, almost kindly, "Good night, Mrs. Chalmers." The next morning arrived with a softness that felt almost deliberate. A polite, well-bred morning, sunlight filtered through gauze and chimneys, offering the illusion that everything in Flaxborough was as it should be. Inspector Purbright, however, had long learned that serenity was the town's favourite disguise. By 9 o'clock he had decided the time had come for tea, not for himself, but for Mrs. Mabel Chalmers. He telephoned just after breakfast, his tone courteous, even deferential. "Mrs. Chalmers, I wonder if I might trouble you for a few minutes this afternoon. At your convenience, of course. There are one or two small matters concerning the guild accounts." Her answer came without hesitation, smooth and light as silk. "Why, of course, Inspector. Do come at 4. I'll have the kettle on." Purbright replaced the receiver with quiet satisfaction. A person's willingness to receive visitors often depended less on innocence than on confidence. And confidence, in his experience, could be brittle. When he arrived that afternoon, the Chalmers residence looked as respectable as ever, the curtains drawn to precisely the same degree in every window. Mrs. Chalmers herself greeted him in a pale lavender dress and a smile measured to the inch. The parlour smelled faintly of polish and the sort of biscuits that were meant to last through conversation rather than complement it. "Do sit down, Inspector," she said, gesturing toward the floral sofa. "You'll take sugar?" "1 lump, thank you," Purbright replied, accepting the cup. "You have a beautiful home, Mrs. Chalmers, a great credit to the town's aesthetic standards." She inclined her head modestly. "I believe one should always strive for harmony, Inspector. Disorder breeds all sorts of unpleasantness." "Quite so," he said. "And yet it seems Miss Harby's death has stirred a certain amount of disorder. Papers misplaced, funds misrecorded, and of course the fire at the boathouse." "You must find it distressing." Her smile faltered only slightly. "It is all very regrettable. Poor woman. She was so very intense about things that hardly mattered. One wishes she could have found contentment." "Contentment," said Purbright softly, "is often fatal to curiosity." For a moment, neither spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked with exaggerated propriety. Mrs. Chalmers adjusted her cup, her fingers perfectly still, except for one small tremor. Brief, but enough for Purbright to notice, he continued, conversationally. "It's remarkable, really, how thorough Miss Harby was. I understand she made duplicates of all guild records. Rather foresighted of her." A pause. Then lightly, "Did she?"
"I wasn't aware."
"Though that does sound like Alma, indeed. One of her copies, unfortunately, was destroyed in the fire." Purbright stirred his tea as though the matter were trivial. "But another may still exist." Mrs. Chalmers looked up quickly.
"Another?"
"Possibly. She may have lodged certain documents with the Ministry of Local Affairs. They were investigating irregularities in the illumination funds." Her smile returned, faintly strained now. Surely that's all been cleared up? My husband would never allow such misunderstandings. Purbright finished gently. I'm sure he wouldn't. Still, the ministry is thorough. They'll want explanations. One can hardly blame them. Mrs. Chalmers set her cup down with care, the china clinking softly. Inspector, if you're implying that I, or my husband, had anything to do with that poor woman's death, I must protest. I imply nothing, Purbright said pleasantly. But the umbrella, you see, complicates matters. It was found in the town hall storage room, not far from where the boathouse records had been kept.
Odd coincidence, wouldn't you say?
Her expression didn't change, but the faintest colour rose to her cheeks.
I told you I must have misplaced it. Quite so.
Only I wondered, if you had been home early that evening, as the mayor said, how could you have left it behind at the town hall after the gala? The silence that followed was fragile as glass. A motor car passed outside. The ticking clock resumed its small, relentless march. Mrs. Chalmers' reply, when it came, was quiet but perfectly even. My husband was mistaken. I returned briefly to fetch something I had left. It was after the crowd dispersed.
I thought no one would mind. Of course not, Purbright said, setting his cup aside. Only it seems Miss Harby was still there.
Perhaps she saw you. Perhaps she said something she shouldn't have. Her eyes met his then, calm, bright, and entirely still. You imagine too much, Inspector. It's part of my occupation, he said mildly. Though imagination in this case is hardly needed. The guild books, the letter to the ministry, the fire, they all trace back to a single effort. Someone wanted to tidy away Alma Harby's thoroughness, permanently. A pause stretched, long and soft as the afternoon light. Then Mrs. Chalmers rose, smoothing her dress. You are a perceptive man, Inspector, but perception is not proof. Without proof, all you have is tea. Purbright stood too, adjusting his hat. Quite right, Mrs. Chalmers. Tea in time. Fortunately, I tend to have both. He gave a small bow, the sort that belonged more to courtesy than victory, and made for the door. She followed him to the hallway, her poise restored. As he stepped out onto the gravel path, she said, If you discover anything further, do keep me informed.
I so dislike unfinished business. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable.
As do I, Mrs. Chalmers. But then Flaxborough is full of unfinished business. It's what keeps us all civil. He walked away, the faint crunch of gravel marking each deliberate step. Behind him, the door closed with the soft finality of confidence reasserted. Purbright did not look back. He knew she would be watching from the window, just as she had watched the town hall the night before. But this time he also knew she had understood something new, that the game had shifted. Back at the station, he found Sergeant Malley waiting with a small brown envelope. Came by post this morning, sir. From Norby, the lab report. Purbright opened it, unfolded the single sheet within, and read the first line. Then, slowly, he smiled. A thin, quiet smile that had nothing of triumph in it, only inevitability. Tell the coroner, he said, to delay the final report. We'll need to add an appendix, Malley blinked. Appendix, sir?
Yes, a small one.
Just to confirm that Miss Harby didn't drown before she died. The following day dawned grey and steady, as if the weather itself had decided to remain neutral until Flaxborough sorted out its latest embarrassment. Inside the police station, Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, pipe unlit, watching the smoke that wasn't there. He had slept little, though not out of agitation. It was the sort of night that required stillness, a pause between discovery and disclosure. Sergeant Malley arrived with the first post and the usual air of reluctant optimism. Morning, sir. Coroner sent his preliminary note. He held out the paper as though it might sting. You were right. Miss Harby's lungs were dry. Death by asphyxiation, not drowning, Purbright nodded. Smothered lightly, then placed in the pond. Death rearranged for public consumption, Malley whistled softly.
That's cold work, sir.
Whoever did it must have had help. Or opportunity, said Purbright, which in Flaxborough is usually the same thing. He set the report aside, his eyes distant for a moment. "Fetch the mayor, would you? Tell him it's a matter of civic clarity." By 11, Mayor Chalmers was seated opposite him, visibly uncomfortable, his chain of office glinting with unconvincing authority. He looked like a man preparing for an operation without anaesthetic. "Inspector," he began, attempting cheerfulness, "if this is about the unfortunate business—" "It is about several unfortunate businesses," Purbright interrupted gently. "Some financial, some mortal. It seems Miss Harby was not the careless woman people imagined. She died protecting her accuracy." The mayor's hands clenched on his knees. "Surely you don't mean— she discovered that the illumination funds had been adjusted, transferred through guild accounts, and into a private one under your name. Whether that account was your doing or your wife's, I've yet to decide." Chalmers's colour faded to something between parchment and guilt. "You've no proof?" Purbright opened a folder. "The Ministry of Local Affairs has kindly provided it. Miss Harby's letter reached them before her death, though delayed by internal red tape. It includes bank details and a record of the discrepancy. There is also, regrettably, a statement of intent, her plan to reveal it publicly at the next guild meeting." For a moment, only the clock filled the room. Then the mayor said weakly, "She was wrong."
"I never meant it was temporary. A simple matter of convenience," Purbright supplied.
"The usual justification for sin. Your wife understood that better than you, I think. She corrected your oversight permanently." The mayor's eyes widened.
"Mabel? No, she'd never—" "She did," Purbright said quietly.
"She went back to the pond that night, met Miss Harby, argued, perhaps even tried persuasion first. When that failed, she used the silk scarf Miss Harby carried. Efficient, silent. Then she pushed the body into the water and returned home. The umbrella was left behind, inconvenient evidence she later hid at the town hall." The man's mouth opened, but no sound followed. Purbright continued, not unkindly. "She then burned the guild copies of the accounts, thinking to erase the link. But she misjudged one thing. Alma Harby's letter, sent before the gala, had already reached London." There was a long pause. The mayor's face seemed to fold inward, like paper collapsing around a flame. "She did it for me," he said finally, in a voice so small it might have belonged to a schoolboy. "I told her the money would be replaced.
She thought
exposure would ruin everything. The council, our name? She said a scandal was worse than a sin." Purbright regarded him for a moment, then stood. "That's the trouble with scandal, Mr. Chalmers. It only offends the living." The mayor buried his face in his hands. When he spoke again, it was muffled. "What will happen now?" "The usual sequence," Purbright said. "Statements, formalities, proceedings, order restored in moderation." He paused, then added gently, "Your wife is at home, I imagine?" "Yes. She'll want to see you before we call." By late afternoon, Mrs. Chalmers sat in her drawing room, poised as though expecting a guest for tea. Her composure was unblemished. When Purbright entered, she rose with the same grace she had shown every day of her careful life. "So it's finished then?" she said simply. "Nearly," he replied. She smiled faintly. "I suppose my husband told you everything?" "Men do once they realize morality can't be balanced like a ledger." "I told him very little," Purbright said. "He told me the rest. There was no resistance, no plea. Only that composed silence that came from a woman who had rehearsed the scene long before he arrived. It was meant to be quiet," she said softly. "She was going to destroy us. Everything we'd built, our standing, our work. She wouldn't listen."
"I only meant to frighten her. I never thought that she'd die,"
Purbright finished. Her eyes flickered. "That she'd make me do it." For a moment, he saw her not as a murderer, but as a monument to control, undone by its own precision. In Flaxborough, it seemed, even death was an extension of tidiness. She folded her hands.
"You'll want to take me now," he nodded once.
"Yes, Mrs. Chalmers." As they left the house, dusk was settling over the town again. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp stone. Across the square, the Millpond lights had been switched on early, small golden orbs trembling across the water. Their reflection wavered, imperfect, but enduring. Purbright watched them for a moment as Mrs. Chalmers was escorted to the waiting car. The mayor stood on the steps of the town hall, hat in hand, looking smaller than any official had a right to be. The car door closed with a sound like punctuation at the end of a long, polite sentence. When it drove away, Purbright remained a while longer by the pond. The lights shivered across the water, and for once he allowed himself a sigh, not of relief, but recognition. Order, in Flaxborough, was always restored, but only in moderation. It was the town's way of ensuring employment for both conscience and gossip. He turned at last toward the station, the faintest smile ghosting his face. Another file would be opened, another closed. People would mourn, then resume the art of appearing ordinary. Tomorrow the market would bustle again, the guild would reconvene, and the town's quiet machinery of civility would hum back into motion. Cleaner, on the surface, as always, than underneath. Purbright reached his office just as the first bell of evening tolled from St. Luke's. He hung his hat, sat at his desk, and wrote a single sentence in his notebook. Death by courtesy. Motive, preservation of appearances. Then, closing it carefully, he leaned back, watching the lamplight flicker on the window pane. Steady, calm, and faintly deceitful. A week after the arrest, Flaxborough began, as it always did, to recover from its latest moral convulsion. The newspapers had moved on, leaving behind a few careful lines about an unfortunate misunderstanding and the swift professionalism of the local constabulary. In the High Street, shopkeepers returned to their habitual greetings. Gossip, once feverish, mellowed back into the slow hum of daily observation. It was almost as if Miss Harby had never existed, or rather as if she had been tidied away, her tragedy folded neatly into the town's private archive of things better left unmentioned. The Millpond, too, had resumed its composure. Its surface was once again smooth and decorous, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of a duck or the faint tremor of a breeze. The new lamps reflected perfectly in its water, untroubled by memory. To an outsider, it might have appeared a picture of civic harmony, gold light, clean air, polite stillness. But to Inspector Purbright, who stood there one late afternoon, it looked rather like a mirror that had learned discretion. He watched as a child dropped a pebble into the pond, sending a single widening circle across the reflections. It broke the image briefly, then settled back into calm. The boy laughed and ran off toward the square, where the market stalls were being packed away. Purbright's gaze lingered on the ripples until they faded. Sergeant Malley appeared at his shoulder, hands in his pockets. "Quiet again, sir," he said, half as statement, half as apology. "Always is," Purbright replied. "Flaxborough has a remarkable gift for forgetting. It's practically civic policy," Malley smiled faintly. "Still can't say people aren't relieved. The mayor's staying on, I hear. Temporary arrangement till elections, relief and amnesia," said Purbright. "Our two strongest institutions." He looked out over the water again, his tone turning thoughtful. "They'll speak of Mrs. Chalmers as tragic soon enough. Not wicked, not guilty, and just tragic. It's safer that way. Gives everyone the comfort of distance." Malley shifted uncomfortably. She confessed without much fuss, though, almost polite about it. She was a tidy woman, Purbright said. Politeness was her form of repentance. For a while they stood in silence, the sounds of the town soft around them, the clatter of carts, the echo of voices closing their day. Life, it seemed, was rehearsing its return to normality with quiet efficiency. Even the Women's Guild, Purbright had heard, planned to meet next week, in remembrance and renewed purpose. He suspected their minutes would omit certain names. "Funny thing," Malley said after a while. "All this started over a few missing pounds in a charity fund. You'd think murder would take more incentive than that." Purbright shook his head. "Money's rarely about value, Malley. It's about pride. Who has it, who keeps it, and who mustn't be seen to lose it. Mrs. Chalmers understood that perfectly. She didn't kill for greed. she killed to preserve a fiction. Keep the arithmetic of her life tidy, Mally frowned. And the mayor? He'll serve his penance in reputation, which is much more painful than prison.
I imagine his speeches will be shorter now. The sergeant gave a quiet chuckle. I dare say the guild won't let him forget it. Oh, they will, said Purbright, turning at last from the water.
They'll forgive him first. That's how forgetting begins here. They walked back toward the high street, passing the neat rows of shops and the post office, where Miss Teal stood arranging letters with the contented air of someone whose world was safely predictable again. She nodded to the inspector as though to assure him that civic stability had been restored through adequate correspondence. By the time Purbright reached the station, the lamps were being lit one by one. Their glow spread gently over the cobbles, gilding puddles and shadows alike. He paused on the steps, watching the familiar shapes of the town settle into their evening pattern. Inside, the office smelled faintly of paper and pipe smoke. The tin box from the boathouse had been returned from Norby, its contents catalogued, sealed, and filed away. Purbright opened it one last time. Inside lay only ash now, the remnants of what Miss Harby had once guarded so fiercely. He stared at it for a long moment before closing the lid again, softly, as one might close a prayer book. He sat at his desk, the single lamp burning low, and began to write his report. The sentences came easily, formal, restrained, unemotional. He wrote of evidence, of sequence, of motive, each line another layer of calm over the rawness beneath. At the end, he added one final note in the margin. A tragedy of order, where neatness outweighed mercy. When he set his pen down, the room was silent except for the faint tick of the clock. It struck 8:30, a sound at once punctual and forgiving. Purbright leaned back, folding his hands. He could almost hear the town beyond the walls. Laughter in the pub, a cart's slow rumble on the cobbles, a piano from an open window. The music wavered, pleasant but off-key, the sort of tune that would soon fade into background habit. He rose, extinguished the lamp, and went to the window. Outside, the Millpond lights gleamed again, small, steady, untroubled. They shimmered across the surface where Alma Harby had once floated, their reflections neat and unbroken now. He watched them for a moment longer, then murmured to himself, "The pond reflects again." It was neither satisfaction nor sorrow in his voice, merely acceptance. Another case closed, another pattern restored. The water would keep its secrets, the town its civility, and both would go on reflecting whatever peace they required. Purbright turned away from the window, took his coat from the stand and walked out into the night. The door closed softly behind him, leaving the office empty but orderly, a small pocket of calm in a town that preferred its quiet lies to its noisy truths. Outside, the air was cool and faintly sweet with the scent of rain. The inspector crossed the square, the faint glow of the Millpond trailing behind him like a reflection that refused to fade. He did not look back.